Moin, ihr wunderbare Menschen des Interwebs. Ich begrüße euch ganz herzlich zurück zu meinem Let's Play von The Great Ace-Attorney Chronicles. Wir werden uns heute einmal die Aussage von Dr. Siphon hören, denn wir haben darauf bestanden, dass die Frau einmal aussagen sollte und von Siegs ist der gleichen Meinung gewesen. Und deswegen steht die Gute nun mit Mr. Drebber für eine Aussage. Thank you for your attendance at such short notice, Dr. Siph. Disappointed in you, Lord von Siegs. You've completely betrayed the agreed policy of both Scotland Yard and the prosecutor's office. Betrayal is not in my nature, as long as the truth isn't compromised. If it is, if there's even a hint of wrongdoing, then no matter whom it concerns or disgrunts, I will pursue the matter to the bitter end, as would any prosecutor worth his salt. Mr. Drebber, you took the victim's life by means of a machine that you constructed in your workshop. And Dr. Siph, as the investigating coroner, you were the first on the scene to examine the victim's body. It is the belief of the defense that you collaborated with each other and were both complicit in this crime. And where's your evidence? At present, we have no definitive evidence, but we do have a very significant clue. What are you talking about? I'm talking, of course, about the waxwork. This model of the killer, known as the Professor, who was sentenced to death 10 years ago. You don't need to tell me. I witnessed the man's execution with my own eyes, and officially pronounced him dead. That remains to be seen. Is that so? According to newspaper reports from the time on the night following his execution, the killer came back to life. Don't waste my time. And the sole witness to that mysterious event was you, Mr. Drebber, wasn't it? If what you saw in the graveyard that night 10 years ago wasn't some chilling fiction but reality, it would make you privy to a very great secret of Dr. Siph's, a secret so profound it could compel the coroner to agree to collaborate in your evil scheme and fact. Mr. Drebber, tell the court, tell everyone the truth of what you saw that night in Lowgate Cemetery. What an interesting twist. Oh. Ja, wieder an normal zu reden? Ah. When at the time, not one person would take me seriously. Yet now here we are 10 years later, and suddenly my story matters. And in a court of law too. Very well then, if everyone so wishes. Let's be frank, I will tell you the truth of what happened that night for what it's worth. So, Mr. Drebber, your testimony, please, about the events of that night 10 years ago. You will tell the court exactly what you stumbled across in Lowgate Cemetery. Yes, of course, as you wish. Okay, back to robot. In the cemetery 10 years earlier. The reason I was in Lowgate Cemetery at all 10 years ago was for a spot of moonlightning, shall we say? Yes, the illustration in that newspaper article was based on what I witnessed that night. But thinking back now, I realized that I never actually saw the professor. Soon afterwards, I was visited by a young woman who sculpted a model of me from wax. Then I gave up on my dream of becoming a scientist, and it was all because of that newspaper article. Wait a minute, you're claiming you didn't actually see the professor now? Of course, you'd have to have a screw loose if you believed a corpse could come back from the dead. But so you're saying this article is not worth the paper it's printed on? I think that would describe it perfectly, yes. If the details in the article aren't true, it nullifies your argument for why Mr. Drebber and Dr. Seif would have been working together. So he's discrediting himself to cripple my argument? Tell me, witness, you claim to have been in the cemetery on some auxiliary business. Can you elaborate? That's right, grave robbing to be precise. As you know, Lowgate Cemetery is at the rear of Berkeley Prison, so among students at the university it had a reputation for being haunted by the ghosts of condemned convicts. Grave robbing, you say? Yes, exhuming fresh corpses to sell is reasonably lucrative. Of course, I never laid a finger on any valuables buried with the dead. So you were one of the so-called resurrectionists, a particularly unpleasant scourge on society. Actually, my fellows and I went by another name, the Repurpers. That is quite beyond the pale. You would invite divine retribution, sir. Yes, well, I think I suffered retribution enough. The Daily Circus eventually unearthed my name and put it in print. It cost me a great many headaches. In the end, I had to leave the university. That was the only paper with the bad grace to identify me unambitiously, I might add. I see. Out of interest, who drew the illustration for this article? Ah, yes, that was the reporter who exposed me. He sketched it right in front of me as I described the scene. Obviously, as time ticked on, I bitterly regretted what I'd done. Claiming to have seen something I never truly saw. Foolish, very foolish. Well, counsel for the defense, you may proceed to the cross-examination now. At once, my lord. Okay. Wir müssen ja irgendwann nochmal das aufdecken, dass Mr. Asman derjenige war, der diese Illustration gezeichnet hat. Okay, the reason I was in Lowgate Cemetery at all 10 years ago was Moonlight. Yes, the illustration and the newspaper article was based on what I witnessed that night. Aber sagt ja dann später, dass das nicht das war. Yeah, thinking back now, I realized that I never actually saw the professor. What are you talking about? I think I explained already, didn't I? Lowgate Cemetery is at the rear of Berkeley Prison, so it was renowned among us students at the university for being haunted by the ghosts of condemned convicts. For some absurd reason, I was scared of the graveyard at night. Verzeihung, musste einmal kurz husten hier. And as a result, only too willing to believe that nonsense about the dead coming back to life. But you said you actually saw it. I said what I'd seen in my mind's eye. After all, resurrection is impossible, isn't it? You would have to be unhinged to think otherwise. Unless, of course, you have some evidence that proves I encountered the professor that night. I don't know. Is there any material evidence that could show you really did see the professor? Do we have anything at all, Mr. Naruhodo? I know, I need to present it against that irritatingly backtracking statement of his. The point is, that night was a pivotal moment in my life. Soon afterwards, I was visited by a young woman who sculpted a model of me from wax. That young woman being Madame to Spells, of course. Precisely, I must say I didn't expect to run into her again like this 10 years later. As I have explained, I went by the name published in the article and I found the man. Yes, the article in the Daily Circus, I think you said. I was a poor student with barely a penny to my name at the time. And the young lady put £5 in front of me. So you readily consented to having a waxwork of yourself made and gave permission for it to be put on display. I did. I should sell what little I had to sell, I concluded. I remember now. I purchased something else from you that day. Mein Französisch ist leider zu schlecht. Ich habe Französisch nie wieder benutzt, seitdem ich aus der Schule bin. Did you? I can say I remember. What was it, madam? This camera. Oh, yes, I made a point of taking it with me whenever I made an excursion into any cemetery. You took a camera with you, sir. To what end? To record the details of the bodies I disinterred. But I had no intention of ever visiting a graveyard again after that night, so I sold it. I see. But I still have it, monsieur. It is part of the special exhibit in my House of Horrors. I'm very meticulous about such details. It is the Tuspel's way. Would seem then this is the very camera Mr. Drebber took with him to Lowgate Cemetery on the night in question. Yes, interesting. Okay, details of the camera have been updated in the court records. Und auf der Innenseite von der Kamera ist ja Blut. Ne? Also when the lens is extended, dark staining can be seen on the bellows. Then I gave up on my dream of becoming a scientist and it was all because of that newspaper article. Okay, so das ist... Ich weiß jetzt nicht, warum ich das nochmal als Robo-Stimme vorgelesen habe. Okay, das bringt uns ja nicht wirklich weiter. Also, das ist ja im Prinzip nur seine Karriere, wurde ruiniert wegen diesem Zeitungsartikel. Also für mich ist das schon mal ein sehr, sehr großes Motiv, Asman dafür umbringen zu wollen. Also das ist für mich schon ein sehr heftiges Motiv. Aber, okay, Naruhodo meinte doch bei... Hier... Thinking back now, I realized that I never actually saw the professor at all, though. Dass wir einen Beweis vorlegen sollten, wenn oder dass Naruhodo Beweise braucht. Ich glaube, ich könnte es mal versuchen mit dem Zeitungsartikel. Sorry, Mr. Drebber, but I don't believe that. Don't believe what? Your latest claim. You did see the professor on that night 10 years ago. Oh dear, we seem to be at odds, but I was there, and you were not. I know what I didn't see. The illustration with this article was drawn based upon what you told the journalist that you witnessed. A figure emerging from a tomb, wearing an iron mask. Yes, when the killer was tried 10 years ago, it was decided in the closest courts, ruling that the man would wear the mask to hide his identity. It wasn't to be removed even during his execution and subsequent burial. Not even the prison wardens were to see the man's face, but obviously the provision of this mask was not public knowledge. So, Mr. Drebber, as you've just heard, a lowly student of the University of London certainly wouldn't have known about the condemned man's mask, so unless you'd actually seen the professor that night, it's inconceivable that the artist would have included the mask in that illustration. Well, Mr. Drebber? It's a vile scene, isn't it, if you look closely? And as I've already been at pains to point out, I was utterly petrified, which is why I had in my head that I'd seen such a blood-curdling sight. But afterwards I came to my senses and realized that I'd been mistaken. You're still saying you didn't see it? If you're stubbornly sticking to that story, witness, Then amend your testimony to explain exactly how you think your eyes deceived you. Of course, only too happy to oblige. I can't believe he's still not going to consent the point. What in fact witnessed was a fellow grave robber at work. What I in fact witnessed was a fellow grave robber at work. A fellow grave robber? What are you talking about? Well, I wasn't the only one busy in the cemetery that night, you know. Other body snatchers were at work. Of course, when I saw one emerging from the hole he dug, my heart very nearly stopped. So that's the terrifying sight I actually saw, you see. You're claiming it was just another student on equally insalubrious business as yourself. Many of the medical students would wear metal masks to protect them from bacteria during dissections. Clearly the fellow was using such a mask to protect his anonymity, wouldn't you say? But there's more to the story, isn't there? The article goes on to say, in the next second, a gunshot rang out suddenly from behind. The bullet pierced the resurrected man's chest, whose breath then stilled once more. We might assume that the sexton discovered the miscreants at work, perhaps, and fired upon one of them. If a gravedigger had shot someone in the cemetery, I think it might have been rather big news, my lord. Oh, yes, well, I can only assume it was an embellishment bolted on later by the reporter. Madam to spells. Don't take it out on Mr. Sholmes. Oh la la, pardon. I was lost in my thoughts. Would it be fair to say that Mr. Drebber's last remark was significant to you in some way? I thought it was a little strange, that is all. How Monsieur Drebber could claim this now. If you don't mind me saying, madame, what are you talking about? Well, when I met you 10 years ago at your university dormitory, you recounted to me about your adventures in the cemetery, no? Including the gunshot. You might want to watch your tongue, you know? Have a care, Drebber. That's no way to speak to a lady. Please, Madame to spells. Carry on. Of course. According to what Monsieur Drebber told me at the time, he did hear a gunshot from behind him and the bullet hit the condemned man. I said nothing of the sort. Oh, you were very explicit about the details, about the mask that the figure was wearing, and the blood that spattered over you when he was shot. Enough, shut up, woman, you're making all this up. That will do. Mr. Drebber. Yes. You refute the account just given by Madame to spells. I have no recollection of ever saying those things. Come on, do you really expect us to believe you? Control yourself, counsel. I will not permit baseless accusations in my courtroom. Right. Under the circumstances, I think it best that you supplement your testimony with a statement to clarify your position on this witness. Very well. Okay. There was no gunshot from behind me at all, nor any spattering blood. Das stimmt nicht, weil das können wir beweisen. Und zwar die Kamera ist der Beweis dafür, dass da sehr wohl es einen kleinen Splatter-Effekt gab mit Blut, weil auf der Kamera das Blut nämlich zu finden ist. Mr. Drebber, do you remember this camera? But that is the camera from the fateful night. Yes, we borrowed it from the House of Horrors. It's the camera you took with you to the cemetery that night, Mr. Drebber. And is that supposed to be significant? Now, this kind of camera is rarely seen in our homeland, so my colleague and I were keen to examine it closely. We noticed that the lens extends forwards on the end of some bellows. Like this. What's that? They're just on the bellows. It looks like a dark red stain. That's right. It's a rather conspicuous mark here on the bellows, in fact. Good lord, are you suggesting? Yes, my lord. It would appear to be a spatter of blood. Something that could be confirmed with a simple chemical test. Isn't it right, Dr. Seif? It would be difficult to determine if it was human blood and not the blood of some animal. But yes, to test whether or not it's blood at all is simple enough. I propose that Madame Tuspel's testimony was correct, and that on the night in question 10 years ago, you were spattered with blood from the gunshot wound. Well, And that furthermore, you really did witness the condemned professor emerging from his tomb. There's simply no way you could have forgotten such a traumatic experience. In other words, the only explanation is that you're trying to hide the fact that you saw the professor that night. But why? Why would he want to do that? Well, not for his own gain, it would seem. For whose then? Who could benefit? Mr. Drebber is obviously lying in order to protect somebody. My goodness, he's shielding someone. Yes, my lord. And clearly, it's someone who doesn't want the truth about the professor's coming back to life to be exposed. Well, counsel, who is it then? Who is this witness trying to protect by lying about what he saw that night? Ja, das kann nur Dr. Seif sein. The obvious answer is Dr. Seif. Whatever do you mean? Imagine if the convict who'd been sentenced to death was not in fact killed. Imagine if that was to come to light. What are you insinuating? And imagine if the convict in question was the country's most hated mass murderer. If it was the professor, that would be an unprecedented scandal. This is beyond a joke. Need I point out that the dead cannot come back to life? What you're suggesting would mean that the execution never actually happened. Yes, that's exactly what it would mean. Once a man is sent to the gallows, he hangs. No one could escape, not in Great Britain. But the fact is, there was a witness to the fact that the man did escape his hanging. If that were really true, counsel, the implications of misconduct would not stop at the supervising coroner. It would taint the honor of the entire judiciary from the ground up. And it's exactly because of those monumental repercussions that Dr. Seif would consent to any demand made of her by someone who threatened to expose the secret, even if that man being complicit in a crime. You mean? I mean that Dr. Seif wasn't collaborating in Mr. Drebber's wicked scheme. She was into collaborating into collaborating, also gezwungen. Also sie wurde gezwungen, mit ihm zusammenzuarbeiten, in order to protect her decade-old secret. She switched the dead body of Mr. Esmond with the waxwork model and fabricated the autopsy report. Lord von Zieks? Pray forgive my freshly filled hello chilies and a whole raft of other discourtesies now. Goodness me. It's just the sort of tall tale Londoners would enjoy, I grant you. An executed killer rising from the dead, a Scotland Yard cover-up, a conspiracy at the highest levels. So let me ask you one thing. What's that? If the condemned man really did emerge from his tomb that night only to be shot in the chest, who pulled the trigger? And disposed of him forever? Well, I have no idea at the moment. have too little information to work that out at present, I think. I couldn't agree more. The Old Bailey is no place for wild fantasies. And have you considered this, my learned Nipponese friend? Considered what? Do you realize just what a dangerous endeavor it would be to this woman into such criminal activity? It's tantamount to declaring war on the entire British police force and Judiciary. Das Wort spreche ich übrigens auch nicht richtig. Quite hard to imagine any sum of money being offered for research could warrant it. To rely on some stage deception when so much is at stake would be madness. Well, I suppose. And this was no petty crime either. The victim was murdered. A man who'd already invested money in the venture and would be instrumental in future profits too. Yes, I had no reason to kill Mr. Esmond at all. Or are you forgetting that his death results in me receiving not a single penny? Aber erst der die Zeichnung angefertigt hat. The court is already aware of the contract between myself and the victim now. There is the contract, that's very true. The motive for this case runs deep though. I can feel it. Using threats to force the head of the forensic investigation team to cooperate is extreme, especially for a government grant he had no guarantee of receiving in the first place. If the research grant was the aim, taking Mr. Esmond's life would have made no sense anyway. Which means Mr. Drebber's motive wasn't money at all. He was just trying to kill Mr. Esmond. But why? What was his motive then? Your time is up, my learned friend. I would say you have one last chance before the jury lose their patience with this charade. Let's see if you can back up your heady proposal, shall we? How do you explain why this engineer would throw all caution to the wind and threaten his own country? At this point, I'm not prepared to listen to more of this outlandish conjecture without proof. So, counsel, present your evidence. Alright, exactly was Mr. Esmond to Drebber. There's a connection there that no one's seen yet, and I'm going to have to present 2 pieces of evidence to show what it is. Yes, my lord. The evidence that establishes a motive and explain why the witness wanted the victim dead is right here. It's this newspaper article, my lord. That was written 10 years ago, and every detail has been examined already. What can it possibly tell us? That drivel should never have been written. It's typical gutter press nonsense that means nothing. Yes, on its own, it isn't particularly significant. However, when considered alongside another piece of evidence, it will completely explain your motive for wanting Mr. Esmond dead. What other evidence? Counsel, you will present your supplementary evidence without delay. The evidence, which when cross-referenced with the newspaper article, establishes a motive for the deed. Damn it. Okay, also der Zeitungsartikel ist ja richtig. Ich wünschte, ich könnte einfach beim Zeitungsartikel darauf hinweisen, dass der Name drauf steht. Er hat ja seine Signatur hinterlassen, weil er hat die Illustration angefertigt. Aber da habe ich jetzt keinen Beweis für. The evidence which when cross-referenced with the newspaper article. Oh, cross-referenced. Wait. Habe ich hier Hier habe ich doch die Unterschrift von. Ja, hier. Oddie Esmond, Anok Drebber. Also der Vertrag. Hoffe ich. Ja, okay. It's this contract, my lord. Mr. Drebber, this is the contract you signed with Mr. Esmond. Yes, that's right. The very document, in fact. That proves I had no reason to kill the man. No, I'm afraid not. There's something very significant that this newspaper article and the contract have in common. Really? And it's that common link. That shows very clearly why you were determined to kill Mr. Odiasman. It seems the defense has uncovered something the rest of us have missed. So, my learned friend, point out what these two pieces of evidence have in common. Where exactly is the link between this newspaper article and the contract? Okay, jetzt darf ich einmal hier hinzeigen. Das ist die Signatur. What these two pieces of evidence have in common is the signature. The signature? The signature on the illustration that accompanies the 10-year-old article and the signature on the contract belong to the same person. As the court has heard, this illustration was drawn 10 years ago by the newspaper reporter who found Mr. Drebber and interviewed him about his ordeal. If you look closely, the reporter's signature can be seen in the bottom right corner of the drawing. And if you look at the contract here, which was signed between the witness and the victim last year, you can clearly see Mr. Asman's signature at the bottom. Let me see now. Good lord, yes, they are identical. In short, the journalist who drew the illustration and wrote the article published about Mr. Drebber 10 years ago was the victim of this case, Mr. Odiasman. But explain to the court why. Why would that constitute a motive for the witness to murder Asman? Well, if you think back, you will remember that Mr. Drebber talked about that article in his testimony. At the time, you were a student of the University of London who dreamt of becoming a scientist. However, this single newspaper article changed your entire life. So Mr. Asman used to be a newspaper journalist, did he? He did, my lord. In fact, it's a widely held belief that Asman managed to position himself at the heart of his criminal network, thanks to the many dubious connections he made during his time as reporter. So, you had to give up on your dream and leave university. You lost everything. Eventually, you found yourself working in the field of science, but only in the shadows. And all because of that article, written by Mr. Asman. Stop this endless drivel about my life. Explain yourself, Mr. Drebber. Yes, it's true. I had to leave the university as a result of the article. But it was just the straw that broke the camel's back. What do you mean? Almost every student of science in the faculty was too poor to actually conduct any research. But they struggled on with their hypotheses anyway. We all did, only to have them taken by vultures. Sooner or later, you knew your ideas would be stolen and patented by some wretch or other, after all. Good gracious. Making a name for yourself as a scientist in a climate like that was a miracle only a select few geniuses could ever hope to achieve. Personally, I wasn't one of those geniuses, so it was hardly a wrench. Being forced out of university because of Lowgate was the best thing that could have happened to me. Mr. Drebber, do you genuinely believe that? Who's better placed to know whether or not I possess a talent for science than me? I am sorry to say that your words don't ring true at all. And I have evidence to prove it. How are you in a position to say anything about me? I don't know you from Adam. Fine, if you think you have evidence, go ahead, show it. What could you possibly have to disprove the idea that I was happy to leave university because I lack talent. Das dürfte der Science Award sein, die Science Trophy. Do you remember this, Mr. Drebber? We found it at your workshop. It's the Royal Society Trophy for Excellence in Science. What exactly is this trophy, Counsel? It's the greatest honor that can be bestowed on a young scientist, my lord. There is no higher accolade. It recognizes emerging talent and promises a bright future. Good gracious. Your prospects for the future were excellent, weren't they, Mr. Drebber? Because even then, you were a genius in your field. But you lost everything. You had no more future. Your talents would go to waste. All as a result of this one newspaper article. I don't know when you realized who Mr. Esmond was, but when it dawned on you that he was the same journalist who 10 years ago ruined your life, it's abundantly clear that you had no intention of forgiving the man. The truth is, finally, he's going to fold. Fine. Clearly, this has run its course now. I admit it. All of it. What? What are you doing? It's exactly as the Japanese man said. I was forced into going along with this man's plot to murder the victim, on the condition that he kept my dirty secret from 10 years ago. Dr. Scythe, do you realize what you're saying, woman? It's all true. That day, when I arrived at the Crystal Tower and saw the birdcage, my heart nearly stopped beating. That memory from a decade ago that I'd done my best to bury deep inside myself. It was the professor again, staring me in the face. And then, before I had a chance to react, I noticed something else. There was a note tucked inside the model's jacket. Dr. Scythe, you will go along with my plan, from someone who knows the truth about what really happened that night 10 years ago. All the instructions were there in the note. Every detail was meticulously written out. I had no choice but to do what it said. I made the necessary alterations to the scene and fabricated the autopsy report as instructed. There was really no other choice. It had to be done to protect the... Harry. Ich muss das schlagen. Ich weiß leider nicht mehr, was spricht. I can only apologize now. Oder was heißt nachschlagen? Nicht nachschlagen. Ich weiß, was das bedeutet. Ich muss den guten alten Google Translator einmal befragen, wenn es ausspricht. Why on earth would you buckle now? Well, there's no point trying to hide it anymore, is there? I would have done anything to stop it coming out. Even collaborate in a murder. But the great lie about that execution 10 years ago has been exposed. Whatever happens, I'm finished. So then, Mr. Drebber, what do you say to that? Your accomplice has admitted everything. Surely it goes without saying. You admit your part in it too, then? I admit nothing. At all. Have you forgotten that the kinesis machine was ripped to shreds by an explosion? Short of me admitting to a crime, There's really no possible way for you to prove I did anything wrong. Whatever this man says, I admit everything. He threatened to expose my secret, so I went along with his plan. And Lord Van Zieks, yes. I hope you will accept my apologies. What happens next is in your hands, of course. I have heard more than enough now. I hereby present the final findings of this court. This trial is not the proper forum in which to pursue the alleged wrongdoings of Mr. Drebber. The defendant is Professor Albert Hairbrain. Very true. It had slipped my mind. Isn't he one of your closest friends? As the court has heard, Dr. Seif has admitted to the allegations brought by the defense, thereby absolving the defendant of any possible guilt. You mean... At the present time, it is the conclusion of this court that the defendant was not involved in any wrongdoing. Does the prosecution have any objection? None, my lord. Congratulations, Mr. Naruhodo. You've proven Professor Hairbrain's innocence. Without further ado, then, the adjudication... Unless the prosecution or defense have any other matters to discuss. I don't know. This doesn't feel quite right. Why did Dr. Seif suddenly admit to it like that? Is everything alright, Mr. Naruhodo? Like you said before, the way the trial is set to end now, the judge will certainly deliver a verdict of not guilty. But is that really what we want? What the defense should be pushing for now is... The defense objects to the trial ending at this time, my lord. I beg your pardon. We demand one final testimony. You do realize I'm about to adjudicate in favor of your client, I presume? What are you playing at now, my Nipponese friend? Why would you want to obstruct the conclusion of the trial at this point? No defense lawyer in his right mind would do that. Naruhodo, what exactly are you thinking? The truth, the whole truth, and the way to bring it all out into the open. Yes, in hindsight. Yes, one word of warning before I go. If, in the course of the trial this afternoon, you perceive even a shadow of doubt about the truth, don't let it out of your sight. Pursue it like a dog with a bone. To the bitter end, you understand? Do not falter, whatever may come to pass. I'm sure Mr. Sholmes knew. He must have deduced that this would happen. Yes, I'm here in court to advocate for my client and to secure an acquittal. Obviously. But that's not all. I believe that I have a duty to the court to pursue the whole truth of the case until every last detail is laid bare. Mein Gott, ich kann nicht mehr vorlesen. And that is why the defense calls for further testimony from Dr. Seif. Testimony from me? About what? About the nature of your collaboration with Mr. Enoch Drebber. In case it's escaped your attention, I've already admitted to everything I did. The whole truth has already been revealed, so stop wasting everyone's time. As his lordship made very plain, your client will get the acquittal you wanted for him. There's simply no point protracting this business further with another tedious cross-examination. Pray forgive my careless handling of that hallowed bottle. I slipped. That's what you call it? What is your objection, Lord von Zieks? The prosecution also calls for supplementary testimony from the witness. Don't be stupid. If there is more to this case than has yet come to light, then I will join my learned friend in pursuing the facts until the bitter end. You will what? Lord von Zieks. This is most irregular, to say the least. However, as the prosecution also calls for it, I will uphold the request. Dr. Seif, you will testify for the court, explaining the full extent of your involvement in the murder apparently committed by Mr. Drebber. Very well. Okay. Der Waxwork-Plot. Diese Aussage werden wir uns aber erst im nächsten Part anhören. Ich entschuldige mich nochmal für das falsche Vorlesen teilweise. Ich glaube, jetzt in dem Part sind mir da ein paar mehr Ausrutscher passiert. Ich meine, Englisch ist nicht meine Muttersprache, deswegen, ne, da muss man immer ein bisschen Rücksicht drauf nehmen. Auch wenn ich sehr gerne versuche, alles richtig auszusprechen, weil ich die Sprache auch sehr mag. Es gibt einfach sehr viele Wörter, die ich halt nie benutze und nie ausspreche. Aber ja, hier gibt es jetzt erstmal einen Cut. Wir werden uns diese Aussage im nächsten Part anhören. Und da bin ich gespannt, was dort am Ende bei herauskommen wird. Ich bedanke mich ganz herzlich fürs Zusehen. Hoffe, ihr hattet Spaß. Und wenn ihr mögt, sehen wir uns sehr, sehr gerne im nächsten Part wieder. Bis dahin. Ciao.